Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. We're here to discuss soil health in the context of rangelands. As we all know, soil health is a real hot topic. These days, there's a documentary, Kiss the Ground, on Netflix. There's also soil health legislation in several states, including Colorado, which we'll hear about later. And all of you have been working in soil health in some way for many years, whether as a rancher or a researcher. So not really a hot topic or a new topic for us, but presently nuanced by a really global interest in soil. So this group represents a diverse group of people working in rangelands, and I'm excited to have a robust and healthy discussion on what soil health means in Colorado. In my region, we have the shortgrass prairie, where we don't necessarily have these huge, deep root systems like in Nebraska or Kansas, where there's, a much greater ability to sequester carbon, for example. And so because of this, I'm trying to figure out how Colorado rangelands kind of fit into the overall soil health movement.
We have approximately 40 million acres, or 60% of our state is defined as rangeland.
Okay, so Jeff, I want to talk about potential on these rangelands in the context of vegetation and soil health. And I'm going to quote you directly in a paper that you published in 2016. And it says, like all land use and management planning, the process should begin with the evaluation of the sustainable potential of each pasture or watershed, taking advantage of the extensive resources already available. So could you talk a little bit about how you are defining potential based on these resources that are already available?
In fact, the United States has by far the best rangeland information system in the entire world. And it's called the Ecological Site System. And we can access that. We can talk later about exactly how to access that. But basically, we can get access to this information. And what we've done in the United States, rangeland scientists, long before I was around, basically went out and characterized the land in terms of its variability and created these things called ecological sites. So what defines the potential on a site is your texture, your depth, your slope, the shape of the slope, where you are on the landscape. Those are the kinds of things that define the potential. Now, soil health can be really poor or really good on any soil. But the potential soil health is going to vary. So a deep, loamy soil down in a toe slope is going to have much, much higher potential to sequester carbon than, say, a coarse, sandy soil up on a ridge that's maybe on a southwest facing slope. Why? Because of the vegetation. And it all goes back to that vegetation, because the vegetation is the engine that creates the organic matter that we're adding to the soil. And not only that, but it also creates the structure of the soil, the pores in the soil from those roots and the microorganisms and the dung beetles and everything else that's feeding on that organic matter ultimately depend on that input from the vegetation, whether it goes through the cow or it goes directly into the soil or wildlife or what have you. And so the way that we define a healthy rangeland soil is uniform across the landscape. It's a soil that has higher organic matter, better soil structure, better infiltration of water, holds more water, cycles nutrients more efficiently, etc. But what a healthy soil looks like varies tremendously as we go across the landscape. And it's really important to take that into account when we're going out and evaluating healthy soils. And the tools that we have available to us allow us to do that. We basically scale our soil health evaluation to what the soil's potential is.
Can you discuss potential in terms of carbon storage and soil organic matter?
But the amount of carbon that a site can sequester depends on two things. One is how much vegetation can you produce, because that's obviously what's creating the carbon to start with. And then the second is how much clay you've got in the soil, because the clay is what helps hold the carbon and keep the microbes, which are actually really good. But for microbes to live, obviously, they got to eat something, and they're going to eat that carbon, and some of it's going to go back up into the atmosphere. And so what the clay does is once the microbes have really processed that carbon, it helps hold that carbon. And so a soil with more clay can hold more carbon. But the main thing is we got to get those carbon inputs going. And if we don't have vegetation, we're not going to be able to do that. So a lot of times people have real big expectations of what rangeland can sequester in terms of carbon. And yeah, we got a lot of land. We can sequester a lot of carbon, but we got to be realistic about this. If we're only getting 8 inches of precipitation, we're not going to grow a lot of grass, no matter how we manage it.
Right. So it's a combination of vegetative growth, but then also texture. So even if you had a lot of vegetative growth in a sandy soil, you're not going to sequester as much carbon in that sandy soil than you might in a loamy soil, for example.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
You can go to Florida on their sandy soils, and you can dig into those soils. They got tons of production. There's hardly any carbon.
Right. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay. So obviously, you know, we can't manage a system or rangelands in the arid West without thinking about grazing. So it's a very big part of our ecosystem. So let's dive into some of the research on soils, grazing, and rangelands. Specifically, I'd like to discuss a paper that a few of you were part of and just recently published. Congratulations. And the paper is Cattle Conservation and Carbon in the Western Great Plains and the lead author is John Sanderson from CSU. And amongst the 20 or so authors on this paper, Justin, Jeff, Grady, and Rachel were all part of that publication. So thank you all for being here. Justin, can you give us the background on this paper and some of the key findings?
Sure, thanks, Annie. And again, appreciation to those co-authors that are on this call. A tremendous amount of work and really a lot of scientific and managerial talent contribute to that. When that paper was originally put together, you know, I think we all struggled, and Jeff brought this eloquently up, with the variability in soils, how livestock and management interact with soil carbon. Experiments are done at small spatial scales over short time periods. And so what could we put together in terms of gleaning information across the Western Great Plains in terms of emergent trends, right? And I think there were 4 key ones that came out of that paper that we attempted to pull together. And one, Jeff's already touched on this, but the big drivers at the large scale for soil carbon are climate and soil texture. So that kind of sets the boundaries and the potential for which we can look at stocks of carbon, carbon sequestration potential, below ground activity. 2 is a fundamental understanding that on our rangelands in Colorado, 80 to 90% of the ecosystem carbon is below ground. Right? So it's essentially a forest flipped over, upside down. We don't see that because what we see is that vegetation or the tools such as livestock grazing that vegetation. So we need to be cognizant that most of the carbon and that activity is below ground. 3, in these systems that are highly variable in terms of precipitation, weather, and climate, we know that in wet years, we sequester and do a good job of putting carbon in the ground because, as Jeff noted well, we grow vegetation. That vegetation then allows root activities and soil carbon to be formed. However, in contrast, in the dry years, we lose carbon. So it's a balancing game there of wet versus dry years and how management interacts with that. And then 4th, across the studies, and there's few, but there's quite a good range of them, we were able to determine that there's a small potential on native rangelands in eastern Colorado to increase soil carbon with proper and good rangeland management because, again, of this fact of modifying vegetation and the deep amount of carbon, large amount of carbon that's stored below ground. This is in contrast into what we found. It's about 21 inches, Annie, where the kind of the tipping point is. You get above that in terms of precipitation. So those are the wet areas to the east, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, where we see management actually can have a potential decrease in soil carbon because of those systems. Now, in our systems, again, we can drive the changes in community composition. We can drive the changes in terms of plant growth and carbon inputs with below 21 inches because of that management. So that was a key finding, and I think really it pertains to Colorado ranchers on the eastern part of the state. There is potential. It's small, but there is potential.
Great, thank you so much for that summary. And of course, I really appreciated Jeff's, discussion about how so much of that variability is attributed to a soil's potential. So thanks for that. So we're gonna talk to Stephen Grady. You both have, where are you? There you are, Steve. Like looking on the screen to see where you are. You both have an excellent reputation for grazing management. Have you seen positive effects on soil health from your grazing management? And Steve, let's start with you.
Okay. I guess the short answer is yes and no. It all depends on the moisture we get per year. So for instance, I just made some quick notes here. Since 2015 was the last fairly wet year we had. Since that time, we've seen a 50% decrease in the number of animals we run here. So I guess my point there is some areas don't look very good. It's all due to the drought that's going on right here. I'm talking about the rangeland on our irrigated pastures or sub-irrigated pastures where we do some ultra-high stock density grazing. We've seen improvements, but not on the rangeland. The rangeland to me looks like it has gone backwards in the last 5 years. And I wanted to point out too, I read recently a book called Cattleman's Cavalcade. George Everett is the author, and it was a historical look back on some of the area around us. In the 1860s and 70s, they ran thousands of cows in the South Park area around Black Dome, the IM Ranch. That country couldn't support 200 now.
Right.
So the potential is there for very productive soils on rangeland. It's been very degraded. So, my push is, how do I get back to that point?
Absolutely, yeah. And we have the same, I think that we have the same kind of historic records from, Bent County too, about how, our production used to be. I mean, there are stories of, of the grass, midway up the horse's belly. Mm-hmm. And you don't really see that now. Mm-hmm. And so that is a question that maybe Justin or Jeff might be able to help us out with, is can we get it back to some of those historic records? Grady, how about you?
So I really like Jeff's comment that vegetation is the engine. That struck me in terms of my experience here. 25 years ago, our ecosystem here hadn't gone through a full transition of state, but as Jeff described, there are symptoms of moving towards a transition of state, and our system had some of those symptoms. It was dominated by the shorter warm season grasses. For us, that's blue grama. And we did not have a significant suite of cool season grasses or shrubs. And in our grazing experience over a long period of time, we were able to, using the timing of grazing and planning our grazing with the specific goal of recruiting initially cool season grasses and eventually shrubs as well, we were able to change our suite of plants. And I think what Jeff said, vegetation is the engine. The things that I saw as we changed that suite of plants The first one is we were ending up leaving higher residuals. Our cool season plants tend to be taller grasses. They're also, their range of palatability during the year, they have a fairly short window of palatability during the year, which means that a lot of times when we graze a specific pasture, they don't utilize those grasses. And for that reason, we were leaving much higher residuals. Also, the timing of our grazing was very focused on seasonality and what specific plants used in different seasons. So that those high residuals, I think, have had a long-term, and by long-term, I mean tens of years, impact on our soil. I think Steve's point is well taken, though. Our ability to maintain that diversity of plants is definitely weather-driven, and our cool seasons increase and decrease as sometimes it's not so much our annual precip, it's the seasonality of our precip.
Right.
But I feel like over a long term, we have been able to improve our soil health by having those higher residuals of grass left on the land and by having growing roots in the soil 8, maybe 10, maybe 12 months out of the year instead of just while the warm season grasses are growing.
Right. I really like that idea of thinking about which species will leave the most residual and grazing for that. You know, I when I'm on the plains, I often see squirrel tail, for example, as leaving high residuals, and you can really see how that affects water infiltration in a big afternoon thunderstorm that we might get in July. So I really like that concept a lot. Thanks for adding that.
One more comment on that. Our poster child for what you described is Galleta. So our cattle will always defoliate Blue Grandma before Galleta. And at first, as we started increasing the amounts of Galleta, my thoughts were, man, maybe I need to get rid of some of this. It's not a good thing. But one, it drives water cycle, like you're saying, and two, it is incredible resilience in a drought. In a drought, cattle will go to the Galleta and do well on it.
I think where some of the confusion lies is in the whole idea of animal impact and the benefits of animal impact. And we certainly do see some good benefits from animal impact, but it has to be in the right ecosystem with the right potential. I've spent quite a bit of time at Steve's, and he does practice high density stocking, but in a small portion of his ranch, he also uses high density stocking for targeted grazing. So and we've seen some interesting, I think probably positive impacts from that too. Steve, do you want to talk about how you decide whether or not you can high intensity graze or not?
Well, it all has to do on the productive potential. So, for instance, we only use this high stock density method on about 2% of our place, which isn't a whole lot. And the rest of the time, we're on rangeland.
I think this question is the most confusing question for producers that are thinking about managed grazing of any kind. And I think they think that managed grazing means high density grazing, and it absolutely does not. But our whole grazing program is focused on recovery. And I think in arid climates, and there are times and situations where I think the graze period becomes an important variable. Having a fairly short graze period when we're really wet in the spring and things are growing really fast, I at times do worry about the length of my graze period. But over a period of years, I focus 10 times more on my recovery period than I do my graze period, which means I'm not going to have those huge stock densities.
Right. And I think it's important to be stocked so that you can adjust throughout the year. Steve, he grazes, ultra high density grazes a very small percentage of the ranch, but then there's a, much larger part of the ranch where they graze differently. And then, I think that his marketing is, is a really big part of being able to manage that way, having those slaughter spots, having that market already there. So let's see, moving along, we can't talk, Justin, actually, there's been some really great research that's come out of CARM in terms of stocking rate. And I was hoping that you could just give us some of the brief, bullet points, important bullet points on stocking rate that you have recently published on and based on kind of a long duration of time.
So stocking rate, as Grady is well mentioned, is the #1 king in terms of the tool. We get that wrong and we're going to have a mismatch between forage availability and animal demand. And then you have to count on time there. So if you have the capacity to change in time, then you can look at matching, flexible stocking rate and numbers, such as Steve and others do with their marketing, to change as the forage conditions and weather conditions change. So in terms of eastern Colorado, where we have really grazing resilient rangelands, and I think it's clear that we can manipulate several factors. And that could be stocking rate, could be time, rest of grazing, to increase the productivity of those rangelands, where we increase the ability for more C3 perennial grasses in composition, more shrubs. That gets us deeper roots, allows us the potential to capture more of that soil water and keep higher productivity potential of those sites, as Jeff has mentioned. So we have a lot of tools in the toolbox to do that. And what that does is help us balance in the good times where we can sequester carbon and mitigate with adaptive management in those times of drought, where typically we would see high stocking rates over the season-long grazing and drought years. We're going to reduce carbon. We're going to blow that off with respiration. Here's an opportunity to use flexible stocking and other adaptive management capacity in the manager system to put those animals on the right places at the right time and match forage availability with animal demand to help us, again, in the longer term, incrementally increase carbon and improve that site potential that's there.
Okay, great.
Hey, Andy, can I jump in real quick?
Yes, please, Kevin.
Just to sort of circle back to Retta and what everyone has said in between Retta and now on grazing and grazing systems, quote unquote. What strikes me and what we all know is just the incredible complexity of these systems and how each place is really unique in how you need to approach it. And we haven't even talked about economics and social factors, right?
Yeah, and that economic component is huge. It's absolutely huge, because if a ranch can't survive, the economics of a ranch do not survive. What may happen in Colorado is you sell that ranch, it gets subdivided, and the last I heard, concrete doesn't sequester any carbon. So it's a really big, huge question in Colorado. Okay, so Justin, we talked a little bit about drought and how important drought is in this idea of carbon reserves, for example. Can you kind of summarize how drought was discussed in the paper?
Sure, thanks, Annie. And again, in a general trend, we know from several studies, not only soil studies, but also sophisticated systems that monitor continuously the flux of carbon, we will lose carbon in dry years. And why? A couple things, right? Low precipitation drives low vegetation. We have a smaller engine. We just don't have the inputs to the system. Also, when things start to dry out in the soils and we do get one of those episodic rainfall events, we'll see a huge pulse in terms of soil and microbial respiration. That carbon that's stored in that upper part of the soil is there, it's activated, and because there's limited amount of root growth, that carbon gets blown back in the atmosphere, and so it's a negative loss there. And so what we want to try to do is try to minimize those sorts of activities that over time they would accumulate up to a pretty substantial loss of carbon. So again, that's coming back to how do we adaptively manage these complex systems to ensure we have sufficient stubble height or stubble amount of vegetation to allow that rainfall to enter in and slowly start that system, get that engine going. And how do we start to utilize flexible stocking, matching those animals, removing them proactively rather than waiting reactively, Annie, till essentially there's nothing left out there. And we're in a situation where it's the only simple thing is to remove all animals.
Right.
So how do we manage that system?
Thank you, Justin. And that's super, super important. Obviously, in practice, it's harder, it's easier said than done. And so really what I'm hearing is how important it is to kind of make improvements during non-drought years, but really figure out a way to maintain during those drought years. Steve, can you tell us what strategies you have during the non-drought years versus the drought years?
Strategies. Well, so the first strategy I have is I have a drought plan written up. I wrote that drought plan during a wet time when there wasn't pressure on. So now I try to follow that drought plan. You know, it's got critical dates that I try to observe. You know, I record I'm very religious about recording precipitation daily. So I chart that. I also use stock days per acre per inch of rain metric, which is kind of my canary in the coal mine. And you know that I chart that. It's a graph that will tell me what's happening. I keep my eye on that. We also proactively, you know, in accordance with my drought plan, we proactively destock before it's I'm forced to. I've been in that position before. It was very painful. One of the keys I feel is the litter you leave on the ground. So that's one of my focus points is I want to prepare that soil for the next rain event. So there's a difference between effective rainfall and I don't know what the other option would be, but I want to capture as much rain that lands on our ranch as possible.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't want any of it going off down the river to Pueblo. None. I want to capture it all right here.
Thanks a lot.
And that, yeah, when that happens in the good years, you've got to lay down that litter in the good years.
Okay, great. Thanks. Grady, do you have anything to add on that? What is your strategy for drought versus non-drought years?
But something I do in good years, two things I do in good years. I will skip pastures as I move through pastures, and I try to make sure it's different ones every time. Logistics can be tough on that, but when it's good, and what I've found is several things happen there. One, it's a drought residual, you know, forage that's sitting there. But in terms of increasing my diversity, there's some species, and four-winged saltbush would be one that I've never successfully recruited with a 1-year deferral. I think it takes at least 2. And I find when I skip those pastures, that's the only time I have success in getting any four-wing recruitment. But also those pastures, that periodic long deferral, they always respond well in terms of production the following year, whatever the weather is. So yeah. I think that's most effective. And then second one would be just leaving as high a residual as possible in those pastures that I do graze.
Right.
And then in terms of in drought years, what we instituted, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago was 3 times a year we sort of do a dormant season grazing plan. And by dormant season grazing plan, I mean that we assume no growth for the next 3 to 4 months. And so in March, we'll go out there and assume no growth. The only time we don't assume no growth is when we go out there if there's 2 feet of snow on the ground. And
Yeah.
maybe a better way to say it is we assume no precip. And so then we adjust our cattle numbers, assuming that there's going to be no more precip in the next 3 to 4 months. And that has kept us ahead. And Steve mentioned the same thing. What you don't want to do is have to destock when the drought has already hit the market.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
we learned that it's always easy to find cattle. So I've never regretted destocking early. And there's been situations where we have gotten rid of stock and then it rained, but we always find a way to utilize that forage. We run whatever I figure our long-term stocking rate could be, we run around half of that as mother cows. And that gives us an annual flexibility to keep our own calves and run them over, to buy calves, to take in other people's cattle. And that's become a standard practice for us, is that our cow-calf enterprise is only planned to use half of our sort of normal forage production.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about grazing management so far, but it sounds like there was quite a bit of discussion amongst you all about amongst the stakeholders in this paper regarding improving rangelands that wasn't totally related to grazing. So what are some of the key discussion points for protecting rangelands, Justin, that you discussed?
Thanks, Ann. Yeah, I think first and foremost, as exemplified by the ranchers here, is just the economic sustainability of their operations. Keeping rangeland in rangeland, Annie. There's a lot of fundamental pressures for changing land use. You've mentioned, concrete poured on top of soils. That's occurring at a fairly rapid rate as the Front Range moves. There's also some tillage of rangelands and others ongoing. So first and foremost, keeping it in rangelands. I think second, there's opportunities here using the site potential that Jeff expanded upon on restored rangelands. So rangelands that have been cultivated in the past have the potential to increase, both in terms of production of above ground and soils, but also those degraded lands that aren't at their full site potential. So can we take management and look at strategically implementing key aspects of the tools in the toolbox to enhance soil carbon sequestration, soil health on those lands in a systematic and strategic way?
The recent history in grazing, the controversy over rotational grazing, I think everyone has to do all they can to avoid that controversy related to what we're headed into with soil health. And I hope a couple things we learn from that is one, that innovation usually comes from the producers, because the producer is forced to make decisions all the time. And a lot of those decisions are essentially made in the dark. On the other hand, making decisions on uncontrolled data and inductive reasoning can lead us down bad rabbit holes. And I think what we hopefully learned from the grazing controversy was that one of those rabbit holes, I think, was driven by the idea that if your range is in poor condition from running too many cattle, the answer is to put more cattle out there. And ultimately, science did its job and saved us from that idea, but it was a painful process to get through. And the thing that strikes me about soils that is different than grazing is I can go out in my pasture and get a pretty good idea of what the ratio of cool season to warm season grasses is, but I can't get into my soil and see the ratio of fungi to bacteria. So I think it's going to be absolutely critical that the producers, the extension scientists, the agency scientists, and the research scientists can get on the same page and get together so that that innovation can come from the producers, but we don't go down bad rabbit holes based on stuff we can't even see in the soil.